Welcome, everyone. I'm Judy Willett. I'm the Senior Project Manager from MGH with the Division of Palliative Care and Geriatric Medicine. And just a few housekeeping things. Number one is you are all muted at this point, so please stay muted so we don't have all that background noise from people's houses or their dogs, etc. And throughout it, we'll be letting people in. Our speaker this evening is Barbara Moscowitz, and Chris White is our other licensed social worker who works in our division and who's wonderful. And he will be introducing Barbara and moderating this evening. So going on, I think many of you know, but if you're new to our program, we are the Dementia Caregiver Support Program. We started at MGH in 2017, and we are part of the Palliative Care and Geriatric Medicine Division. Our mission is to transform memory care, and it's to educate, connect, support patients, caregivers, clinicians, and really everyone in the community about these challenges and about the journey of living with dementia and being a caregiver to someone who lives with dementia. We offer consultations to caregivers and patients in specific MGH clinics, and we're expanding that. Skills classes for caregivers, support groups, health and resiliency programs, and this monthly Conversations with Caregivers program. So we are just delighted that you are here. The Caregiver Support Program is largely funded through philanthropic support. So if you like our programs and you're able to, feel free to contact one of us or go on the dementiacarecollaborative.org and feel free to donate. So I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Chris, and we'll get the evening started. Thanks for being here.
Yeah. Thank you, Judy. Welcome, everybody. Again, my name is Christopher White. I'm one of the clinical social workers here at the Dementia Caregiver Support Program, and it's lovely to have everybody here with us tonight for our second presentation of this particular talk, given some technical difficulties we suffered from last time. So again, the team here consists of Barbara Moscowitz, myself, and Judy Willett as the Senior Project Manager. And tonight we have Barbara as our star tonight. Her title is one of the founders and Dementia Care and Education Specialist. Barbara has worked at Mass General since her graduation from Brandeis University, and she earned her MSW at Boston College. During her tenure, she has staffed the Department of Social Services and became the founding social worker for the MGH Geriatric Medicine Department, through which she designed and directed a program for vulnerable older adults in neighborhoods surrounding the hospital. She has expertise in the continuum of care, from community to acute care and post-acute care options for elder and geriatric populations. She has been frequently recognized for her work. For example, Ms. Moskowitz has wrote the DVD and accompanying workbook for Alzheimer's patients entitled Family Matters, Coming Together for Alzheimer's. Additionally, in 2007, she was a recipient of the Compassionate Caregiver of the Year Award through the MGH-affiliated Kenneth B. Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare. Barbara is a frequent speaker to local community groups, colleges, and social work students, and participates in panels regarding the challenges of living with Alzheimer's and caregiving. And so with that all in mind, welcome, Barbara.
Thank you, Chris. And I know that at least one person was a very brave soul who came last time when there was a technical difficulty. And I will tell you that it's different this time. So kind of you to come again. Slides, please, Judy. Slides? Great. It is just the greatest honor and joy for me to meet with you all tonight. And I'm going to start by answering very simply the question, how does a village provide care for an individual with dementia? Next slide. Well, the answer, the punchline is, it's a challenge, and a village provides care with difficulty. But the beauty and the honor of the Dementia Caregiver Support Program is it's exactly what we were designed for and funded to do. And that is to help people with dementia and their caregivers and family to navigate what we know to be an exquisitely complicated course. But I promise you, contact us, keep in touch with us. Our role is to help you manage. That's what we are here for. We're going to review some basic concepts about caregiving and care receiving. What is dementia? Creating a team. Why is it important? And I very much want to talk about the emotional challenges for people with dementia, couples and siblings. Next slide, please. So this is, this is a quote that follows me everywhere, and I follow. It's spoken by Rosalind Carter, First Lady, years ago. There are only 4 kinds of people in the world: those who have been caregivers, those who are currently caregivers, those who will be caregivers, and those who will need caregivers. Next slide, please. And that means all of us. And the issue of caregiving and care receiving is actually a universal issue. And in many ways, what I'll mention is one that we've somewhat lost track of, because caregiving and care receiving kind of has been medicalized as something that we do or we need when we have an emergency, as opposed to it being, frankly, a developmental reality throughout our lifespan. Now, this, many of you have probably heard, and Lisa Gweither, a wonderful educator from Duke University, has said, if you've met one family with Alzheimer's, you've met one family with Alzheimer's. Next slide, please. Now, that is exquisitely, Judy, next slide. That is very important because, next slide, yeah, that's really important, because not only are all of us different in our lives without illness, dementia as a complicated disease renders us all even more complicated. But there are general themes, which is what we're going to be here to talk about tonight. These are bullets, each of which can be an hour in itself, but I want to mention the changes in caregiving over the decades, both sociological and medically, and why the concept is so prevalent, prominent, and serious in our current environment. And that is that because of the medical advances, we have increased lifespans. Very rarely does one retire, sit on a rocking chair on the porch, and sadly die at 65. We have the benefit of treatment for cancer, for diabetes, for heart disease, and many of us have the benefit of living longer lifespans. Living with chronic illness, but that's advances our years. And so while we have an improved management of illness, it does suggest that acute care intervention, which is what we get in the hospital, does lead to long-term chronic care. And that's frankly something many of you, I have no doubt, know well. Our healthcare system and society is still trying to catch up with. We're terrific with acute care. We also have, in the midst of this time, shorter hospital stays, expedited discharge planning, which means, as many of you have probably experienced, you may have someone come into the hospital with a serious illness. You barely catch your breath, find out the room they're in, and then you're being asked what rehab you'd like your relative to go to. Again, these are the very large and major changes in our healthcare system. One thing that is worthwhile all of us taking note of is that over the last decades, there is a dramatic geographic relocation of nuclear and extended families. Whereas decades ago, it was very common for families to live in triple-decker units or the same community. Some of that still occurs, but in the last numbers of decades, many are encouraged to, find our dreams and move out of state, which is a wonderful thing. As a result, however, if someone does have an acute need for care, or an acute need for assistance, many of our family members who used to perhaps be right there in our community, along with perhaps church, synagogues, neighbors, they're no longer as available as they once were. Not good, not bad, but it's a reality that I think it's important for us just to be remembering. There's also a very profound demographic shift. Many older parents, and there are older caregivers. I just have to tell you anecdotally, about 10 years ago, I met a woman who then was 75, and her father was 105. And okay, I had studied about demographic shifts, but what really helped me experience the profound change was when she called him daddy. And that's when I understood age is in fact a number, because at 105, he was still her daddy. Changes that we all recognize. There are many single parent homes, blended families, reverse migration. For those of you for whom reverse migration is a new concept, you know, the thousands and millions of people who chose to move to Florida, Arizona, and warm temperatures and climates. Well, as those individuals have been aging, living longer with increased lifespans, and becoming ill in need of care, many are coming back to wherever home was. So a sociologist coined that reverse migration. And again, while we need care, there's diminished availability of caregivers, which we'll talk about. And the last thing, which is again, and I know there are some healthcare public policy people in this talk, and they spend a lot of time worrying for us about the fact that long-term care for people with dementia is not covered by Medicare. Next slide, please, or acute care insurance. And if there are listeners who are certain that that makes no sense, my colleagues, Judy and Chris and I want to guarantee you it doesn't make sense. And we hope that, that our advocates are working on it. So here is the essential challenge, and you could say paradox. There's a challenge for greater need and support for prolonged periods of time. That would be for someone with dementia or chronic disease in an era of dispersed family systems and a complex healthcare system, which has not really gotten its act together about how to help us manage chronic care. And most caregiving challenges for people with dementia and chronic illness, in fact, require long-term support in non-hospital settings. Next slide, please. So that is the reality that you're all living with. And again, I just want to reinforce that is what our program is about. We study the environment, we respect and understand the challenges you face, and we're here to help you navigate. I want to go directly into what is dementia. Many of you know, but there's an important reason, which explains again why we say having a team is important, and in fact, why my program exists. When I speak of dementia, some of you may know, dementia is an umbrella term, and it refers to medical conditions. And it is an umbrella term for many forms of cognitive challenges, such as Alzheimer's, Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal lobe dementia, and other types of dementia. Just as if I said to you, someone has heart disease or cancer, you recognize that as a general term, but then want more information. So dementia, in fact, is a general term. People often ask, what is the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's? Well, Alzheimer's is a type of dementia. And I'm going to read these symptoms that are part of the medical condition called dementia. And please note, and that's why these symptoms and the next slide are so important, you won't see the word lesion or paralysis or seizure or headaches or pain management. We're accustomed to that, but please pay attention. Hope you'll pay attention to the symptoms of dementia. Memory loss. And by the way, if any of you just want to write in chat any comments in addition to questions, feel free. What is dementia? Symptoms include memory loss that disrupts daily life, challenges in planning, solving problems, difficulty completing familiar tasks. A task might even be changing the television, VCR, confusion with time or place, trouble with visual or spatial perception, new problems with words in speaking or writing, and with some forms of dementia, that's what we call both expressive and receptive. That means I not only have difficulty finding the word that I want to tell you, if you speak to me, I may not understand a lot of what you're saying. Misplacing things or losing ability to retrace steps. If anybody wants to write in the chat, do you have a relative who loses something? How many times a day and what is it? Decreased or poor judgment. If I went out in the cold weather today in my summer dress, and that's not my standard, that is an illustration of decreased or poor judgment. Withdrawal from work or social activities. Now is holiday season, which presents its own challenges for people with dementia. But in fact, if your relative always adored the activities of the holiday and is suddenly withdrawing, the question is what might be going on. Other quick symptoms might be trouble driving. Oh, please go back. Okay, now next slide, please. Changes in mood or personality, obsessive or repetitive thoughts, holding on to things of seeming little value. Now, all of these are, not everyone has all, but note that none of these describe what we recognize as symptoms of an acute medical illness. And dementia is a disease of behaviors, which is very frequently interpreted as intentional and controllable, or attributed to idiosyncratic actions. In the early to middle stages of the disease, as many of you I know, there are very few physical manifestations of the illness. If my mother had early stage Alzheimer's and it was time to go to a Christmas party, she would appear at that party as elegant as always. Only I, or people who know her well, would know that perhaps she has early stage Alzheimer's. So individuals may look fine with no visible signs of disease. And this is unlike if you know someone who had a stroke and arrives at your house with a left arm paralysis or in a wheelchair, or if I'm undergoing chemotherapy and I don't have hair and perhaps I have my skin tone is off. There are physical manifestations of an illness, and that cues other people as to what might be going on. And what we'll talk about is that when someone has a diagnosis of a probable dementia, this may become a cause within families of conflict, misunderstanding, and crises. Next slide, please. Judy, can you put people on mute, please? Thank you. And okay, I'm going to use a number of quotes because they tell stories much better than I, but this is a quote that I think those of you who are living with someone with dementia or might agree with. One of the hardest things about living with Alzheimer's or any other dementia is the unpredictability. You could study the lists of symptoms and definitions of stages, but no one, not even the most skilled clinician, can predict whether or when the person you love, Chris, would you put people on mute, please? The person you love will, for example, start to wander No. Go back, please. One slide back. One slide back. Thank you. Start to wander or refuse to bathe or have hallucinations. These aren't unusual problems, but many patients never experience these symptoms. And if any of you can, if that resonates for any of you, feel free to write in chat. Now, what we can do, next slide, please. What my colleagues and I and the neurologists and doctors help you to learn is what the general course of dementia may be and at what stage something might appear. Someone might start wandering in the moderate stage of dementia. Can't guarantee, but if you are aware of it as we teach, then there are some things you can do in the house, put some locks on the door, or if I should wander in the middle of the day, you're a little bit emotionally prepared. I have some quotes here from this wonderful, lovely book. And because I think I want to start this talk with hearing from people and families who have lived these experiences. Now, this is from the book Voices, and these are people with dementia. I felt some relief. At first, I was grateful that I didn't have something more life-threatening, such as brain tumor. I also felt a real fear for the future for myself and my family. And that was spoken by Bill. Damn it, am I invisible? This is my disease you're talking about. I'm still here. Talk to me. Chris and Judy, can you please put everyone on mute? And I'll welcome if anybody wants to write in chat that either you experienced. No, please go back. I'm not finished. Well, please go back. Thank you. Okay. And to family members, I say, don't baby me and don't pretend it isn't here. To friends, I say, let me talk about it sometimes. Whether I'm angry or sad, just listen to me. And these last two I find very profound. Listen to my feelings, not just my words. And finally, losing my mind is losing myself. Next slide, please. It is a startling and frightening acknowledgement, but important to know that people you care about and live with have those fears. Now, I see we all work with many couples, and here are some voices of spouses, and they may resonate for some of you who are spouses. Quote, we were in trouble long before the diagnosis. I couldn't understand why my husband's business seemed to be going downhill. When he failed to do something he'd promised to do, I thought he wasn't paying attention or didn't care for me anymore, and I took it personally. We became very unhappy with each other years before guessing he had a medical problem. If any of you want to put in chat, did it take too long? But that's not unusual to figure out your spouse's behavior wasn't volitional, but something else. But again, this is very hard. It's very different from having a lump in my breast or on my shoulder. It's very different than having a heart attack. Here's 3 more quotes. Facility's early signs were depression and fender benders, and she wasn't yet 60. It didn't occur to me that her problem might be dementia. My denial overrode my training as a physician, said Daniel. Next quote, next voice. It's such a challenge to always be thinking for the 2 of us. Now, I want to say that I do hear this a lot. There are many times I think Terry understands or remembers. I sigh, I relax a little, and then I find out I had misread him. I have a feeling there are people who, for whom that resonates. Feel free to comment. Someone else says, John says about his wife, I hate that Peggy is my caregiver now instead of my equal partner. And this final quote is from a wife, not a woof, who said, I need my husband to help me care for my husband, but I don't have him anymore, even though he is still here. I find this, next slide, please, this last quote to resonate for so many, with so many spouses I speak with. And in fact, they are lonely, even though they're sleeping in the same bed or the same room of their partner 50 years. And now we move on to a couple of quotes, and then we'll come back to the bigger themes of adult children or siblings. And these are from Claire Berman, who, frankly, I think in 2008 wrote Caring for Yourself While Caring for Your Aging Parents, 3rd edition. She's still one of the wiser people. When adult children become involved in caring for their parents, it's not unusual for them to regress to an earlier stage of life in their sibling relationships, to find themselves reenacting childhood scripts, keeping tally on who's doing more chores, who's receiving more privileges. Childhood rivalries resurface, old wounds are reopened. And again, if anyone has a comment, please feel free just to write it in if you want to. It's a very understandable reaction. As a parent begins the slow descent into illness and incapacity, the adult child begins the process of mourning. You mourn all the stages of life with your parent. You mourn mommy, mom, mother, the good mother, and the bad, what you had from your parents and what you didn't have. You mourn the vital, able grandparent for your children. I do want to underline a very significant comment that when we are mourning our parents, if we see them aging and at the end of their life, many of us are mourning what we didn't have. Next slide. What we hoped for, what we waited for. And that can bring for us to the caregiving experience a lot of confused emotions. So these are factors that impact caregiving and receiving. And these are just reflections. We can't talk about them, but please see if any of these work for you. We all come from our own communities and families with cultural norms and traditions. I have a feeling there might not be a person here who didn't make a promise to a family member or inherit a legacy that in our family, we don't put people in nursing homes. Perhaps anybody make a promise? Feel free to let us know. The caregiver health matters. I'm working with a caregiver who now is being treated for prostate cancer. And he has been the steady 24/7 caregiver for his wife. So that is something not expected. Relationship history, and then I'll just one more comment again about relationship. You know, Hallmark movies are only Hallmark movies. Real life has its necessary complexities, and not all relationships had been or are simple. So if there is within a spouse, within a couple, or within a family, if there is a history of emotional or physical abuse or violence, if there is a history of addiction, all of that comes with us to the present tense and matters when we work with you to figure out how to care for the person with dementia. The last thing I just want to mention, and this you can see the rest of the list, comfort and discomfort with hands-on care. You know, I spoke last week to a magnificent young woman who's only in her 20s, and her dad just stopped being able to know how to take a shower. And she was very uncomfortable, but her dad, poor man, wasn't clean. And so she did her best to, put a towel around him, but, she felt self-conscious. And it was not a comfortable experience. That was a moment when she wished she had a brother. But again, we want to comment, next slide, please, that, men can't necessarily provide personal care for their moms, nor necessarily women for their dads. Okay, we're gonna go into what seems like an easy question. But remember, I've already defined the fact that caregiving is relatively newly defined and in our lives now. We never used to think about it as an event because our families were more blended and we cared for each other at all times. So when we think of the kind of caregiving many of you know, we speak of informal unpaid caregivers, spouses, children, grandchildren, neighbors, friends, and volunteers. You know, during the pandemic, many grandchildren, when they were home from school and their own parents needed to go to work, especially became the caregivers to their grandparents with dementia. And then there are the formal paid caregivers. Those are the homemakers, the home health aides, personal care assistants. And I just want to comment, this wouldn't be real if I didn't acknowledge for all of you that since the pandemic, perhaps the greatest shortage among all of the healthcare providers, we know that there are a shortage of nurses and others, but personal care assistants, the people who keep our relatives functioning, clean, changed, directed in our house or assisted livings or nursing homes, there's a dramatic shortage. If you think you're experiencing it, I can validate that for you. And now you can answer these questions if you want. They're not meant to be anything other than reflections. Are you a caregiver if you buy groceries, schedule a medical appointment, and live 1 hour away? Are you a caregiver if the person with dementia lives in assisted living or a skilled nursing home? Are you a caregiver if you contribute to the cost of care from long distance? Next slide, please. And here's a concept, well, the obvious, but it's the flip side of my giving care to my mother, to my father. He or she is suddenly at a time in life when they need to receive assistance. And we don't speak enough, I think, because often my colleagues and I are meeting families and people who are ill at a moment of crisis, which we regret. And sometimes we have to organize ourselves so quickly. But what is so apparent and so important to recognize is that receiving care for an adult who has lived an autonomous, sophisticated life, who has had a profession, a job, raised a family, driven a car, who has been proud of accomplishment, and suddenly there are changes, and that person is either being directed or told that because of a diagnosis of dementia, which isn't really clear, because I can't point to, you know, an incision on the arm and say that's it. Suddenly there's a loss of autonomy, independence, control. Is there anybody in the audience who can manage losing control over your life? If there is, identify yourself and our identity. Many people experience feeling helpless. They might be surrounded by a number of exquisitely generous and helping people, but they are confused because if they have a brain disease, they might be confused about their needs and they don't quite know what direction to go in. Sometimes there's resignation, sometimes fear, always fear, and sometimes anger. I know many of you, and please let us know if any of them resonate for you with your person. A lot of family members, a lot of spouses and adult children become the unfortunate objects of their relatives' anger. And of course, you're the one doing the most. And I often get a call where, you know, we went to my cousin's for Thanksgiving and mother was her magnificent self. The minute we got in the car, she was yelling at me for everything that I didn't do. Now, that's not mother's standard behavior. That was a function of mother holding it together during Thanksgiving and being very confused in that car. Often when someone is ill and has a profound need, there's a need for relocation. So any of you have to close the home of your parent. And if it was a 5-bedroom house where the family was raised and you're moving into assisted living where you have 1 studio, have you experienced trying to help your relative choose the 10 most favorite possessions to move with? It's painful, things we take for granted. Because dementia is a disease which sometimes for some people robs them of insight. And sometimes that's not always denial. That is sometimes a form of dementia. If someone doesn't have insight and I see someone, taking my furniture out of my house or packing a suitcase for me, I might be very defensive or just tell you to get away. I'm fine. An older adult may have hearing loss, decreased vision, already use a walker, again, so that then being confused and having a brain disease renders me even more vulnerable. And what is so profound and important, and that's why I use those quotes at the beginning, many, many, many times, unless someone is diagnosed at a very early stage, and some people are, even as the illness progresses, many of your relatives can't express to you in words their fear and their terror, the fear of the future, their inability to imagine the future. I think sometimes what we see and what we talk a lot about in the fundamental skills class that I teach is when someone is in the stage of dementia where he or she is robbed of the ability to express feelings, the way I express myself, next slide please, instead might be by pacing or screaming with a behavior that is not familiar, but it's what's available to me. And of course, your job as family or best friend or caregiver is to try to figure out what I'm trying to tell you. And in fact, we often talk about caregivers as in fact being detectives, because if I'm your relative with dementia, if I have a pain in my shoulder, if I have pains in my knees, if I'm just terrified because I looked in the mirror and I don't know who I'm seeing, I can't come to you necessarily and say, Mary, I don't recognize who I am. Because the issue here is if I had the ability to tell you that, most likely my dementia would not be diagnosed as being at that stage. So I feel afraid to be left alone. I feel afraid if I don't see you all the time. And I think some of you know the experience of your relative shadowing you, not letting you be out of their sight. And you love them and it can be exhausting. But the reason why I shadow you and follow you everywhere is because if I don't see you, my husband, my wife, my daughter, my cousin, I don't know who I am. So it's difficult to express fears. Now I know I have to go faster. So here, therefore, are the very unique needs of people with dementia and their family. When possible, a diagnosis. Now it's not always possible for a lot of reasons that the neurologists teach us, but as opposed to, I mention this because old age is not the reason, however, for dementia. So never assume that your relative's confusion is because he's 80. You must please have your relative see a doctor. There are a number of medical conditions like thyroid deficiencies, vitamin deficiencies, depression, infections that can create a confusional state. So it is very important to be seen by an internist, a neurologist, or psychiatrist. This slide I'll go quickly with, but I have to say, in this era, you need to identify, this is probably the most important thing I can tell you on this slide, identification of the clinical providers. And this is like, who's your team? Now, we either used to have no one, and now, frankly, some of us have too many, but here's what I mean. There is typically a primary care physician. There may be a neurologist, there may be a psychiatrist, there may be a geriatrician, there may be many social workers and many case managers. If I can give you, truly, I realize this from this slide, my advice, and this will take you far, is to concentrate on who your person has as their primary providers and make your list of those team people, their telephone numbers and their roles. Let me give you an example. I just followed a woman who was ill for about a month. When she was in the emergency room, she was seen by a social worker. When she was up on the unit at the hospital, she was seen by a social worker. When she went to rehab, she had a social worker. And of course, everyone gives her their card. When she went home from rehab, she had magnificent visiting nurse association, and they sent in a social worker. And then that's 4, I think. And number 5 was she was then referred to what we call ASAPs, which are elder service, and they sent a case manager. And number 6 is, if any of you are enrolled in a Medicare Advantage plan, you have a case manager social worker. Now, that's an embarrassment of riches. And frankly, I want to say, sometimes I think it's better almost to have none than 6, because here's what happened the next day. This wonderful woman was home, exhausted, lives alone, and she needed a ride to go see her doctor. She had no idea which social worker to call. And when she did call a few, they said, oh, I don't do that. So that wasn't unkind. And actually, it is wonderful to have all these people. But my advice to you, if you were to want to take one message, and I'm repeating it from tonight, figure out your providers, have their telephone numbers, have their page numbers, but also know when to call them. And if you don't know, ask them. Ask the neurologist. So if my mother is agitated, do I call you? Do I call the psychiatrist? Or do I call the internist? Okay, let's move on now. Next slide. And I'm going to tell you what I've been taught by, after being here for decades and being taught by geriatricians and neurologists. What we do know about dementia is, with the exception of what's called vascular dementia, where there can be a sudden drop if there was what we call a TIA, dementia in itself has a slow, steady decline. When there is a sudden change, when I, in my state of dementia, have, typically walked around the house confused but calm, if I'm suddenly very agitated and yelling, that's an acute change. I've been taught to advise people that's when you call the internist, because that's when there may be a UTI or you need blood work. So your first call, if there is an acute change, is to your doctor. This is a quote I love, and this is a great website, daughterhood.org. It's also for men. Other than the death of a loved one, few things are more disorienting than making the shift from being cared for by your parents to caring for them. This transition is made even more challenging because it usually comes as such a surprise. And it's not just the biologically wired blind spot we have against our parents' vulnerability. It's the utter shock that when it happens, there's no place to turn for help. It's like trying to climb a rock face without any toeholds or crevices where you can grab on, and then scaling without a net. The problem with our aging system, and this is accurate, and again, I'm plugging our program, this is what we're here to help you with, is that even though there's a lot of information out there, the situations most caregivers confront are so incredibly complex, unique, and specific. Why won't rehab providers accept my dad? And they can't find what they need, or they want the one exact right answer to a very complex question that doesn't have the right answer. If any of you, next slide, please, if any of you have that one important question that you recall no one ever answered for you, please let us know in chat. So identifying your team, who are the people you can turn to? And I've added the Alzheimer's Association for all you to know. The third bullet down, we have a magnificent Alzheimer's Association in New Hampshire, and they have a 24-hour hotline, helpline. They're wonderful. Next slide, please. I'm going to go a little faster so we have time. So I think this is a very important area to chat about, the emotional side of caregiving and care receiving. And I'm honored to know many of you on the talk tonight. And I know you all have all of the skills, the information, the medication, the data. And I think it might be safe to assume that many of you are exhausted emotionally and physically. And often the emotional side of caregiving and care receiving is least attended to. And frankly, we know it has to be a top priority. Many emotions surface when an individual is in need of care, for the person with dementia, for the primary caregiver, and for family and friends. At any time, it's normal and understandable to feel ambivalence, anger, anxiety, sadness, frustration, guilt, jealousy. I'm going to stop at guilt. If anybody wants to comment, any of these emotions familiar to you, or you know of someone, I will tell you in my experience as a social worker that I regret more people who are just magnificent family members and caregivers experience guilt. And it's because we all want things to be perfect. We don't want our person to be ill. And we think we must be doing something wrong. And you're not. So the challenge, this is the hard part. The challenge is to know what you need to manage your emotions and how to find the help you need. It's a quote that I've always appreciated from a sister who's speaking of her sister who, after she was just admitted to a memory care unit. The really hard part for me is separating out how lousy it is for me to see my smart, snarky, funny sister walking around the new dementia unit with her stuffed animals from her own reality. She isn't feeling badly. She doesn't recoil from the other people, even when one of the other strokes her stuffed animal. She doesn't really know she's moved. I leave her feeling depressed. Next slide, please. And I have the feeling you all recognize that emotion. Next slide. Thank you. We're going to go quickly now, but I hope you'll review. So those of you who are in couples often have to renegotiate their roles. A caregiver may be frail and ill. Like I said before, there may be a complex marital history. And if that's the case, suddenly caring for someone who follows you around the house all the time and needs you to bathe and prepare meals and all could be a very difficult mix. And there's also a change in intimacy as a result of caregiving for some. Next slide, please. Or what couples do is you find new ways of being intimate. Caregiving for adult children. Adult children, and I covered some of this at the quotes at the beginning, we may lose our real or idealized parents, or frankly, the ones we never had and were always waiting for. I've had the honor of speaking to many sad people who have said, until my father dies, I know I'm waiting for him to tell me he loves me. It's healthy and normal, sad, but to wait. So what we might see at the time of creating your care team, we might see unresolved issues between siblings emerge. And here's a quote from Claire Berman. Many's the time I find myself instinctively reaching for the phone, wanting to talk to my mother about a concern. But then I stop myself because I realize that mother's no longer able to support me in this way. I have found myself of late feeling a mixture of love and irritation toward my mother. She's 84 now, losing her grip on reality, and I have to be there for her instead of the other way around. Next slide, please. I wonder if that's something any of you have experienced. I'm just going to go to one tab on caregiving with siblings. It's really helpful to think about the family roles when growing up. Was your oldest sister always in charge of everyone? And was the youngest one the one who could get away with everything and not have responsibility? Well, 50 years later, we need not assume, next slide, please, that my oldest sister is going to naturally be the one to take care of mother, because maybe my oldest sister now is living on another coast, has a family, has young children, has a profession. Maybe she just can't do it. Maybe it's baby sister. I spoke to a family this morning. Can you kindly skip the next two slides? I'll tell you when to stop. Thank you. One more. Yeah, please stop here. No, back one. I'm sorry. Thank you, Judy. I'm sorry, Judy. I don't mean to give you any difficulty. So I spoke to a woman this morning, a couple this morning, and they kept talking about their baby. And of course, their baby just turned 60. But once a baby, always a baby. And maybe the other siblings assume, oh, she'll never be able to do help because they remember when they were 9, 10, 11, 12. But that baby may now be very capable and eager to provide care. So important when we can. The message is we can't make assumptions. As natural and normal as it is. I'm just going to comment some comments about the primary caregiver, because typically there is one person who might be considered primary, which is not to say the only caregiver, but perhaps the chief caregiver, if it's a spouse or an adult child who lives nearby. And if you are part of the family system and have a meeting and recognize that it's your mother, your father, or my brother Bruce, who is going to be the primary caregiver, these are the gifts, GIFTS, to give to the primary caregiver. And that is to ask, what support does the primary caregiver need and expect to need? Respite from caregiving, help with meals, shopping, cleaning, laundry, managing finances, appointments, medication management. Now, if your team, and this is not your healthcare team, but your caregiving team, your siblings, neighbors, whoever you consider to be in the caregiving team of non-healthcare professionals. So I do want to clarify, you have your healthcare team, that those are the doctors, the social workers, case managers, and now your primary family caregiver team, which can include neighbors. What is often extremely valuable is together to list all of the tasks and jobs that one needs to do, that we need to do for our mother, and then to assign them. Now, if my mother lives in California and I'm here in Boston, I can't deliver meals, but these days I might be able to order with DoorDash, or I might be able to, if I have a well-paying job, I might be able to offer to my brother Bruce, who is caring for dad in the same house, I can offer financial assistance so that he can hire someone to be with our father and he gets to go out. And here is an important thing. Does the primary caregiver request or need emotional support by telephone, email, or visits? Next slide, please. I hear a lot of times, and if any of you want to put in chat, next slide, please, what you would hope that perhaps someone might have offered to you. A lot of primary caregivers or people who are home with their spouses or parents a lot say, you know, I just want someone to call and ask me how I'm doing. But they don't. And, or I really need for my sister who does live an hour away, she could just come by on a Sunday with a meal. Yesterday, I spoke to someone who said his son brings dinner every other Sunday, and that's one meal that he doesn't have to cook. So here's the message here, okay? The message is, for those of you who are the primary caregiver, please do not assume that your relatives and friends know what you need, even though you know what you need. So when you have defined, and you know who the people are in your life who you trust, when you've defined them as a group, I hope they will say to you, okay, Mary, we're here for you. Tell us what you need. Give me an assignment. I'll do it. And if I don't do it, and if you're the caregiver, and you know that these relatives and friends really care, ask. Asking is a really hard thing to do. Now, I'm going to end quickly, but I've got to tell you all about Dr. Pauline Boss. Many of you have heard me talk about her often. We know that one of the profound emotions that relatives, that relatives of people with dementia feel is grief. And yet it doesn't always make sense, because we think that grief is reserved for someone who has died. Dr. Pauline Boss, and she's alive and she's written wonderful books, has said it's a difficult challenge to care for someone who's here, but not here physically, but gone mentally and psychologically. You feel alone, and in some ways you are. For many caregivers, it's as if there's a stranger in the house. This roller coaster of absence and presence is a very stressful kind of loss. And I know that many of you experience this probably every day. And it's what Pauline Boss calls ambiguous loss. Unlike death, there's no official validation or ritual, and sometimes very little community or religious support. You feel you are left to cope on your own. Even the strongest caregivers, and most of you are, feel anxious and depressed. The challenge is to learn strategies to cope with this ambiguity that is so much a part of memory loss. And then just two last slides. Next, okay. Dr. Boss does have what I think is a very valuable tip for coping with ambiguity. By the way, the best tip that I know Chris and Judy and I want to offer, please consider support groups. We have support groups. Consider drop-in centers. Consider ways to virtually speak with people. And then for your internal process, she says, you've got to name the problem. And it's important to name ambiguous loss because it's caused by an illness, not the person with dementia or caregiver. And she speaks about practice both and thinking rather than extremes of either or. And I'm just going to go over these examples. It took me a while to quite get it. I am both a caregiver and a person with my own needs. I take care of both him and myself. I both wish it was over and that my loved one could keep on living. I'm both sad at my loved one's illness and joyful with my new grandchild. I'm both sad about my lost hopes and dreams and happy about some new plans and goals. If some of you who are caregivers, and even if you want to write in, can you think of some both ands? And now one last slide. Can you skip this one, Judy? And then the last slide is this. Somehow this one slide sums up so much for me. I know this woman, remarkable woman. I realize that the challenge for me now is to accept who she is, her mother. If I'm going to get anything other than pain out of being with her, I need to just accept that my mother is gone and that here is someone who needs some emotional caregiving from me. I can't walk away from her, and I don't want to be in such constant pain over her. I'm comforted by the fact that she's no longer struggling as much or is as agitated as she was when she was healthier. Now that's somewhat of a paradox, isn't it? Healthier, but struggling more. That's what's so profound about dementia and complicated. I miss my mother so much, and I just need to find a way to move on from that, which is so difficult while she's alive and sick. I'm hoping if I feel free to separate who she was from who she is, that some of that may come. And then I like the fact, because this sounds like me, I think I'd better go eat my ice cream now in front of the TV. She needed a break. And very last slide now, Judy. This is just which any of you want. These are some resources for you to have. That's it. Can you? And I finished at 6:32 as we hoped. Okay. Thank you all. And Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Barbara. That was wonderful. I think I can safely say that, there was a lot of great wisdom, spoken here tonight. And what I want to do now is kind of give the opportunity, while we have some time, for people to write some questions down in the chat. And while people are writing, I want to just relay some of the quotes that were stated throughout the course of the discussion, if I may. I'm not going to be I won't be saying full names just for confidentiality purposes, but I will say first names just to kind of give credit to those who wrote them. So starting with Mark. Mark said, one of the quotes that he says is, "I'm fine, just a little forgetful." Francis asked a question, what about the person for whom you care for, who doesn't see his or her problems or refuses to talk about it? So I'm sure we'll get to that question in a moment. Another quote from Virginia, it took so many years, I'm assuming, to finally get a name to what was, happening or what was going on. It took so many years, even neurologists kept referring us to marriage counseling. And then it seems to cut off, so I don't know exactly what else was being said. So if you want to clarify, that would be wonderful. Jim says, I was worried when making decisions that I was taking away my wife's agency. Okay, we hear that. Mark says again, I'm mourning the part of me that's now gone. Kathy says, one sibling who lives out of state and rarely visits made a promise to his mother that he would never let her go into a nursing home. And another, Sonia, I believe. My sister-in-law was told point blank, it is even in her dad's will that they read after he passed, or that after he died, that if she or any adult siblings ever put mom, quote unquote, his wife, after he died in a nursing home, she had progressive Alzheimer's even before her husband died, that they would be written out of the will. I'm so sorry to hear that. Mark says again, I just want someone to make decisions instead of always asking me. Ruth says, so much of what Barbara talks about resonates with me, feeling guilty because I don't give my husband enough things to do during the day. He listens nonstop to classical music and Doc Martin. The problem with a simple shower, he will not cooperate. They need to have me in the same room or nearby every minute, even though we have my son, daughter-in-law, and 2 wonderful grandchildren who will respond to his "Where's Ruth?" Sometimes I feel I just need to be alone for a few minutes, and the sadness I feel for him. Penny says, Barbara, you really get it. Thanks. Jan says, my mother, who moved back to Massachusetts with children and husband after 14 years out of state to live with and take care of her father after her mother passed, made it clear that she did not want to burden her children when the time came for her to need care. We also realized that we were unable to care for her at home. Kathy says, because of the disease, you lose your partner or spouse to lean on, as well as your friends, especially other couples that may have been longtime friends. Sorry. Priscilla says, thank you. Would love a copy of the slides. I'm sure if you don't have it already, we'll sending those out following
Yes.
the conclusion of our discussion today. And then Amy says, my mom doesn't want to talk about it either. She has always been good at protecting me from things, and I don't know if she is still doing that or if she forgets she is ill. I'm her primary, so I want her to be able to talk to me about it. I'm a counselor by trade. Thank you, Amy. So again, if there are any specific questions that you would like Barbara to address, please feel free to put them down in the chat below. But going back up, one question that came up was, let me see if I can find it, from Francis. What about the person for whom you care for when he doesn't see his problems or refuses to talk about it? I.e., what if we're, talking about someone who may not have insight?
Right. As Chris would probably agree, I want to say that that is one of the most profound and common questions that I hear people ask of the neurologist. Because again, we don't know, is my mother in denial? Denial is a good thing sometimes. Does she not want to talk about it? Or does she really not have, because of her brain, insight into her deficit? And because sometimes that is very, very much the case. So what I want to say is it's helpful to speak to the neurologist. If they've done scanning of the brain, they may be able to show you that because of such and such lobe, a person has no insight. But since I don't know the answer to that, there are a number of things to do, because another question came up from Miss Chamberlain, who's in our field, who said, my mother refuses to talk about it. I want her to talk about it. So I think the issue of person refuses or person doesn't want to. And again, remember, we're not sure if that person has just a general sense of discomfort, that something's just not okay, but doesn't know how to ask what it is. And if that person perhaps has always been short-tempered, he or she may just be needing to yell. The eggs are too salty. So we don't always know. But here's, I think, the important thing. The important thing is, first of all, to protect yourself. Now, I mean emotionally and physically. If any of your relatives are such that in their state of unintentional agitation, because I don't understand if I have hallucinations and there are people out there, and I don't understand why you won't get rid of them. And if I perhaps get angry, it's very important for you not to argue or not to say, now, Barbara, you have an illness. You're not really seeing those things. What you just need to do always is not argue, be calm, reassure, and keep your person safe. So on the continuum of the person who might be angry and say, I don't have a problem, get out of my way. I think if in that state of anger, that person wants to drive and he or she can't drive, then you intervene actively. You take away the keys, you call the police. You can't let me drive if I have no insight and I'm ill. If it's just my speech during the course of the day, and if I want to read this book or read this book and say, get out of my way, then I think the thing to do is stay as calm as you can and walk away. Unfortunately, you just need to monitor the person for their safety. To the wonderful woman, notice how we keep saying wonderful 3 times because you're a counselor. So Chris and I are biased. You know, what's very interesting, and at the very beginning, there was a quote by a person with dementia who said, "Let me talk, to my family or to my friends. Don't be afraid to ask me, ask me." So what I've experienced is that there are many times when I hear about someone saying, "My mother said to me the other day, 'What is wrong with me? I feel so stupid.' And because I love my mother, I want to say, I said to her, 'Mom, there's nothing wrong. You're fine.' Everybody over 75 has a couple of problems with their memory. You're fine." Now, that is the most loving instinct that I think we all have. But the advice I would give you, and we give to our families now, and to Miss Chamberlain also, is if there's an opening, and if your relative is sad or looks perplexed and is just struggling, join them there. For example, what's wrong with me? I mean, I was a college professor. Now I can't even read the globe. Why am I so, I'm stupid. I hear that a lot. I would say to my mother, "Mom, you're not stupid. The doctor told us you have a problem with your brain. It's not your fault. It's an illness. You do have memory issues. And the good news is, now that we know what it is, the doctors are going to help us help you. We know about exercise. We know about eating well. We're going to work our way through it." So in fact, and I know there's one wonderful woman who shall remain nameless, who did tell her husband it's not his fault, and he got mad. Anyway, but what I want to say is, if you feel there's an opening, join your relative, because he or she is living in a nightmare. Now, if they can't say it, or if they can't go there, we can't go there. We just keep them safe. Does that help? Does that resonate for people? Okay. I also saw and heard someone say, I think Kathy, you said long-term friends have kind of disappeared. Yeah. Have some of you experienced that friends you thought would have stayed around because they are indeed good people have disappeared? Well, we have some theories. I think you might, and I just want to say, I can only imagine how profoundly disappointed and maybe angry and disappointed you are. No doubt you've given of yourself to those people, and why aren't they there for you? Sadly, very sadly, we still live in a society where there's a stigma about Alzheimer's. Remember about 20 years ago, it was cancer. Now cancer is being cured. But Alzheimer's, mental illness, addiction, it terrifies people. And a lot of people say, I hear, but I don't know how to talk to Jim. I mean, what if I say the wrong thing? Or I don't know what to do. It's both, if I go close, and I mean this respectfully, will I catch it? Right there, but for the grace of God, go I. Will I see something that makes me sad, which makes us human? But I think one of the most common issues is your friends don't know how to act around your relative or your partner who has dementia. And they don't know if they should ask questions. They know if they should say, "You look wonderful." They don't know if they should ask, "Do you remember when we were accountants 20 years ago?" They feel really self-conscious. So if you have the energy, if you think that these are friends who want to make an overture and might be afraid, one of the things I suggest is sending an email or a short note saying something like, "It's been a while. Patty and I would love to see you around the holiday time. I'd like to give you an update on how she's doing, and some tips for how we communicate with her. In fact, this is what we suggest to families around the holiday. And some 3 or 4 tips, like, she'll be happy just to see you. No need, and try to avoid asking questions. Instead, make a statement. This is the advice you're giving to your company. Tell her how beautiful she looks. Tell her, because she will look beautiful, you love her hair. And just make a statement rather than ask a question, rather than asking the question, oh, Patty, do you remember when we went to the Cape, 30 years ago? Well, she won't remember, but you can say to her, I remember when we were together at the Cape 10 years ago, you were the best swimmer of all. We had the best time. So what you're doing, okay? So your comments, your advice to people who are afraid is compliment her. Tell her how wonderful he or she looks. Sit and at their level. You look at the person at eye level. Don't speak in a loud voice. They're not deaf, they just are confused. Speak softly. And then with the content is how lovely it is to see you, and perhaps a memory or 2, but you tell them the memory, not ask, because the discomfort is if I don't remember. So I would suggest, and again, many caregivers just don't have the energy, which I respect. If you have energy, you might want to send a tidbit with advice and say, we really miss you. You might say, I really miss you. I really miss my friends. Does that make some sense for people? Anybody want to add to that? Chris, are there any more questions?
Hold on. Yeah, so I think there's a couple comments. First of all, Francis says, Barbara, you're awesome. They love you. And Jim says, my sister-in-law once said to me that it was helpful if I was in the room when she called. It pointed out to me that folks weren't sure how to act. I found that if I invited someone to visit this Kathy with me, they found it much easier to visit and call than on her own.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I understand that there are times when you wish for company in part so you can have a break, but in fact, your relative, if he or she hasn't seen the friend in a long time, he or she will be a little uncomfortable with that person. So if you can sit next to him or her on the couch, it'll be a wonderful visit. And I think you'll feel good, even if you're tired, to have a good visit. And Jim, what you say makes perfect sense. Perfect sense. And obviously a sign of your sister-in-law's trust in you that she was able to tell you what her issues were.
I think just, a question that I might have just to pose to you is, one of the themes is sort of, the nature of changing relationships. But
Mhm.
I also want to maybe identify another, issue that I often, at least with, folks that I work with, are, for families that might have difficult or strained relationships prior to the onset of disease. Kids who, might have strained relationships with their siblings or parents, who now find themselves in a caregiving role, and the uniqueness of that stress as well. I mean, has that ever been something that you've encountered before?
Thank you for asking, Chris, all the time. And that's what I said when I think I threw in, if life were a Hallmark card, none of us would be, those Hallmark movies. Many of us have very complicated histories, and the very important answers, which frankly is why, and I know I keep giving plugs to me and Chris, why we're here for you. When we meet you, which we hope we do, and we ask you to tell us about you and the people who might be the caregiving network, we do wish to understand the relationship you have with the person with dementia, because that impacts everything you'll be deciding. I'll give you a very simple, well, a profound example, but the answer is we expect that to know that so we can help you problem solve. I mentioned earlier, the young woman for whom it was difficult to bathe her father. Now that wasn't a bad relationship, but that was acknowledging a problem issue for her. So I was working with a family a few years ago, 6 children, and their mother and father. They explained that father had a decades-long history of alcoholism. He went to work, but would come home and immediately come home and drink himself to sleep. And when he'd awaken, whenever, and if the kids were noisy, point is he would be both verbally and physically abusive. And their wonderful mother actually knew how to protect them. If father was coming, this is a dramatic story, but it is real, like a lot of our stories. They knew mother's job was to keep her children safe. And so when she saw her husband wake up, she would distract him and get the kids to bed. Now, you want to guess who it is who had Alzheimer's? Mother. So with mother's dementia, she lost every capacity, for no fault of her own, to read the signals of her husband. I mean, the kids were long gone, but she was still living with her husband, who drank the same way. And she couldn't read his signals. She often started wanting to follow him. And very simply, they realized that he didn't have capacity to care for her or to want to care for her. And this was a family that just knew sooner than most that to save her life, she needed to leave the house. But you see, if they hadn't been able to talk with me about a very painful history that was a secret from everyone else, they would not have been able to save their mother. So the answer is yes. Stories, histories matter. They matter greatly. And that's why we need to know.
Thank you, Barbara.
Sure.
Are there any other questions or any other comments that anyone would like to make?
I see that Mark has a comment.
Oh, yes, he does. My apologies, Mark. Mark says, friends have the best of intentions to help, but when something comes up for them, it all comes back to me. The buck stops with me. I think one thing I will just say is, relationships, again, can be complicated. As Barbara mentioned, there is, unfortunately, somewhat of a stigma when it comes to memory loss, dementia spectrum diseases. We wish that weren't the case. I think, Barbara, you can identify, but we often get asked, should I tell, my friends? Should I tell, X, Y, and Z? And it's a hard question to answer oftentimes. What do you say when you get asked that question, Barbara?
Thank you, Chris. And actually what I hear as much, as you probably do too, is my father insists, my husband refuses to tell anybody. And so we start with the question, what are the consequences of that? Now, again, anytime we talk about telling, we're talking about the people in your family or in your network you trust. We're not talking about telling everybody in the retirement center, okay? But so the question is, what are the consequences? So I often will hear, well, we at Thanksgiving, Dad's behavior was so different, and he was rude. He was asking the same question over and over. And I just wish that it's family. I wish that people understood. And so again, what I think I want to offer, I always ask, what are the consequences of people not knowing? So, and the other question is, what does it feel like for you? Now, Mark said, friends often disappear at times, but on the other hand, there are some friends, if we don't tell, they don't know you need them. So my suggestion is, number one, what are the consequences of not telling the relatives. And this is where, and a lot of what we talk about, and we don't have time tonight, there are many times when we love someone with dementia that the most loving things you do feel like betrayal, because you might be you may make a decision to tell your cousins, to tell your relative, when in fact your father has insisted that you don't tell them. And I think the thing is that there comes a time when, and when you want to talk to us or the doctor, if you feel that there's no one or the other, there's kind of both. If you feel that on balance, there's more discomfort for your father with the people who love him, if you don't tell, then I often suggest considering telling. And that might be in the form of a short email, which is saying, at this moment in time, our father doesn't want you to know, but I know you saw at Thanksgiving. He repeated himself many times. He seemed forgetful. He is being evaluated and worked up for a medical condition. You don't have to name it, but you can say there's an issue. All right. So, and again, it's a tough note to end on, but I will. There are a lot of times, and I know a number of you on the screen, where in the course of loving someone and wanting to protect them, it feels like you're betraying your love and trust, because you might be telling the doctor that your father is still driving and we know he shouldn't drive. You might be telling relatives that mother has an illness, dementia. But again, this is when you step back in this very unusual role you're in, and you offer what keeps your relatives safe, because you're building their new world for them. So thank you, everybody. Judy.
Thank you, Barbara.
Yeah.
I believe that is all the time that we have for tonight. So I want to thank you on behalf of myself, Barbara, and Judy, us here at the Dementia Caregiver Support Program, for joining us tonight. If you haven't seen down in the chat, Judy Willett mentioned that January 10th, we will be having a concert with Jason Wang playing the violin. So please join us for that. We'll be sending out a link in the days coming. So just be on the lookout. Okay. Again, thank you for everyone for joining us. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your evening. Have a wonderful holiday and stay warm, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks, Barbara. Great job, Chris.
Thank you all. Take care.